For anybody that is familiar with Microsoft Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform, this navigation or this screen should be quite familiar to you guys. Surprise, surprise, the Microsoft Cloud for Sustainability application is built on the Power Platform and does use Dataverse for its data store, which is really, really good because any other stuff that you're doing with Crimson or implementing with Dynamics 365, it's all the same stuff, which is really, really cool. So just to give you a quick explanation of what we've got here, down the left-hand side is a set of modules and a navigation pane to take us through the right areas. What I've started off is the settings area, and I've started with the company profile. So surprise, surprise, with the sustainability application, the things that we would need to define are really common things like what is your profile, what is the company structure, what are your facilities, or what are your regions of housing stock that we are going to be reporting on. Obviously, this would need to be set up right at the get-go. What I've done here is I've kind of copied and pasted some of the demo data. So the demo data originally was Contoso, which is Microsoft's famous company that doesn't exist. It's now changed to a coffee company. So what I've done is I've relabeled those Crimson, but as you can see, this scenario, we're a global housing association in all areas. So what you can see here is that you can select some of these industries, and that will enable some of the metrics and reporting to be specific. And there is the closest thing that I can find is there is a real estate activity element to that. So some of the other settings that are useful to know, where we've got in here, there are an immense amount of detail that's come out of, what are the greenhouse gases that we are trying to track and record, right down to the specific carbon elements or the HFCs. There's 68 by default in here, which have a GWP factors associated to them. This is obviously can be edited, but again, it's come from industry standard. So these calculations are pretty standard. You also have unit groups. So depending upon how you want to make reportings, again, we've kept this relatively straightforward, kept the energy at megawatts, the distance in meters, the volume in liters, and the weight and mass in metric tons of CO2. So there's some other things around regional mappings, which I won't get onto, but effectively, these are your settings that you would need to set up. Now, what does the Cloud for Sustainability app give you? Well, it gives you the ability to ingest data from a variety of sources. And what it does there, I've got one of my sections here is around data. So if I click on activity data, what you'll see on this screen is the types of activity that happens at each scope. So obviously scope 1, you've got fugitive, industrial, mobile and stationary combustion. So obviously from a housing association perspective, it might be quite high in the mobile combustion area in terms of your fleets. And then obviously scope 2 being the purchased elements, cooling, heat and steam, probably not, but certainly electricity would be quite high up on the agenda of capturing that information. Now, what's really good is if we were to have a look at some of this information, so if I view the activity, what you can see is that I've got my London fleet has some distances, so they're activities that have done at a certain time. So back in 2020, they traveled that far, and there was that much fuel quantity. So raw data can come in about the activities of certain things. Now, this is really, really useful because we can use this information to be able to calculate in a consistent manner the actual the combustion and the amount of CO2 produced for all of these different types of activities. So the way that actually happens is around the calculations and the models. So What I will do now is just take you through an example of how we do the model calculations. So in here, we've got a set of models, and I'll just go to the mobile combustion one because that's the one we've really been talking around. Microsoft allows you to create new models and also view what type of models to actually adhere to. So if you can see on this scenario, we've actually got a calculation where if the source is mobile combustion and the vehicle is on the road, then we're actually doing a different type of fuel calculation than if they weren't on the road, and the different fuel calculations based on that. So you can get really specific in terms of how you're calculating your CO2 and how you want to do that. The way that we can get to the calculation and doing this model is through something called emission factors. Now, emission factors, again, are a guideline of how you can really calculate the emissions for a certain type of activity. So the emissions are the CO2 released for a certain type of vehicle that's traveling a certain distance. You can actually calculate that, and you can have emission factors for that. At the moment, there's a number of obviously government government sort of initiatives that give you some calculations, so you don't have to start from scratch with this stuff. You can import all of the different types of factors. The UK GHG ones, you've got some emission factors here, and I'll just go through one of them. So if we were to do, for example, petrol cars, so on-road petrol vehicles, you have the units in miles, and there's a document reference on the UK GHG, and that will give you some of the calculations around the CH4 and the NO2 actually emitted from a petrol passenger car. So having all of these calculations means that actually what we need to do, one, make sure these calculations are correct and reflective of what we want to be capturing, but once they are set up, they're set up and good to go. Then it's just a fact of how do we consume the activity data within this system to be able to calculate that. If you are at a certain level where you don't have the activity data, but you are, say, you're trying to just put in the amount of emissions, so sort of kind of ignoring the calculations, you already know the emissions, or you don't have the raw activity data, but you do have a summation of the emissions. So what I'm thinking is, in scope 3, when we're talking about housing stock, we don't really have the activity levels. So we can't come in here and import or link a load of activities for our housing stock. But what we do have is the EPC ratings, which give us each year a rough guesstimate on the tonnage of CO2 emitted. Now, this application is flexible enough that we can actually quite simply import those emission calculations, and that will then be included into the scope of what we're trying to report on. So the combination of scope 1, 2, and 3, scope 1 and 2, you may have activities. Good example that I went through, the vehicles on the road, you've got those activities, you can get that in, you can get a really good calculation on your CO2. Maybe the scope 3 stuff, you don't have the activity, but what you do have is a summation of the emissions. So what I'm going to take you through now is how we actually get data in, and I'm doing it for the example of that scope 3, where we've got a set of stock where we know the EPC ratings, so we know how much tonnage of carbons were emitted at a certain time frame. So the way to do that would be, again, looking at scope 3, I've chosen to put the housing stock at downstream leased assets. That might be right, that might not be. I'm looking at the scope categories, that seemed to be the logical one where we would put this information. So what you can see here, there's a couple of elements already in the system. What I'm going to do is go ahead and create a new connection for for consuming more data about my housing stock emissions for downstream leased assets. So I'm going to manage a connection, and this would come into my data connections area. If the demo gods are being kind, that is. Okay, so at the moment, I've only got one activity data, which is the demo one around fridge data. So please ignore that. But what I will need to do is create a new data connection. And as said before, you have your options to import activity data. So the fleet mileage, we could select that and chuck in the activity data. What I'm going to have a look at is the pre-calculated emissions. So I'm going to enter the pre-calculated emissions for my upstream leased assets. Now, I'm going to use Excel because I've just got an Excel spreadsheet. Funnily enough, I don't have, Crimson doesn't have any housing stock, unfortunately, with EPC ratings. But if you had your EPC ratings in your housing management system or within your asset management systems, you can, through connections, to be able to create a connection to that data. So if I clicked on more connections and went forward, you would then have, connecting to Dataverse, connecting to SQL databases, or if you have custom connectors linked to your housing association, your housing management system, brilliant. We would be able to capture some of that information. But for this demonstration, I'm just going to go ahead and load up an Excel file that is a dummy of our emissions. Just going to quickly find that. So this would allow you, even if you didn't have a centralized repository for that data at the moment, if it was in Excel, you would be able to import this information manually, or if it's on a SharePoint, you would be able to point to the SharePoint location, and that information is going. So I'm choosing my housing stock EPC calcs that we did, and I would go next to map the fields. Now, the really cool thing about the sustainability app is that it is through Dataverse, so we do have the data flow capabilities, which this is based on, and we are able to very, very quickly grab some data, grab some information, and be able to transform that into useful information into the system. So I'm just going to quickly select my data. And in a Blue Peter moment, obviously this data is perfectly acceptable in terms of the structure, because we're using this as a demonstration. But again, in this area, you would be able to then transform your information or your data using the Power Query to be able to make it useful. But again, I won't step on too much around how we convert the data in here. That's probably for another day. But as a data analyst, you would be quite FA with doing this sort of thing. But what we're doing really is just mapping the fields of that spreadsheet into the fields in which we're going to then consume the data. So what it's doing now, it's just fixing my issues, computing the schema, and then it will give me a representation of the data that's going to be mapped across. So brilliant. Okay, so I've got a couple of things mapped here. My importantly, the CO2 emissions are mapped, so I know I'm going to get the right information through. What you can do is schedule a refresh. So I could actually refresh, if, say, for example, if somebody else was in control of the spreadsheet and they were populating this, or it was again from a data source that was slightly smarter, SQL data source or something, you would be, for each data connection, be able to supply a data refresh. So this could refresh beginning of every month, beginning of every week. However you're doing, whether it be activity data or emission data, this information can be consumed at appropriate times. I'm just going to say, yeah, once a week, I'm going to do that. And you can obviously, if this is a static spreadsheet, but the data is updated, then certainly you can start, you remove the data that was previously imported the last time. So you just get fresh numbers of the same report if that's what you want to do. I'm just going to go ahead and just call that EPC calcs and create that connection. So again, if this was connecting to some data, you would only have to do this once, set the frequency, and then you would just be safe in the knowledge that the data will continuously be consumed and be calculated in the regular fashion. So, that that data connection is now scheduled to run. What we'll just quickly do is just refresh. And hopefully these emissions will start coming through. Not yet. Beaten with a few errors. No, seems to not have worked. Demo quads are not friendly to me, but effectively what you would be able to see would be some actual emissions data or new emissions data coming through that would be associated, very similar to things like cooling, where you would actually see the raw information around the CO2 emitted. So that's really the first part of the demonstration, is showing you how to import the data and get that data pushed across. The second part of this demonstration is around, okay, so now we've got the data in there. What does that actually mean? How can we see, what our carbon footprint is, and what are the areas, and what's the assessment? So what they've got in here is a couple of areas where you've got some dashboards and some analysis on the carbon emissions. So I'm going to take you through to a dashboard. Which will show you based on the reporting year. So we're doing last year's numbers. It will then calculate all of those emissions that you've loaded in, that are converted from your activities, and show you your total emissions, where you are from the previous year, and a couple of other things, which obviously can be tweaked and changed, and depending upon what you want to see. But what you can see here is very typically, because we're saying our housing stock is scope 3, then the vast majority, what you'd expect to see, the vast majority of the emissions that is responsible for housing association isn't that scope 3. But that's not to say that these things aren't important, and these things we need to look at in terms of the other scopes. What you can do is filter on the scope and work out, okay, what are the total emissions of the year, and you can see that these emissions are going up as the company is growing, as the stock is increasing, or as offices are being created. So we need to start having a look at a plan, understanding where we can make savings in these specific scopes. So looking at the total emissions, what you can see, if you can click on the certain areas, so Crimson Corp, the New York office, is really where a lot of our scope 1 consumption is. Maybe that's because that's where our head office is. Surprise, surprise. But what you can see is an understanding of some of the data you've got, including the percentage of renewable energy that's been consumed, as well as the distribution of that energy as well. So there's a lot in here that allows us to really analyze and assess the information that we've loaded in, that raw data that we've got, and what we need to do to get better. So that, along with The analysis is a different sort of a view of the same dashboard, sort of shows you some really powerful insights into your data. One of the major things, once we've obviously got this data in there and we understand where we need to go to, well, now we need to have a look at the actions. You know, what are we going to do to reduce that carbon footprint down? So one of the areas which Microsoft really useful to allow us to do that, just quickly just show you a different slide element on that, which is the analysis of the emissions. You've got scope 1, 2, and 3. You've got your monthly emissions, and then you've got emissions by source. So obviously that downstream leased assets, which is where I put the housing stock, is quite a large element. You can see, and apologies, there's no map visuals for the European demonstration, but you can see some annual trends around the different scopes and where we're trying to get to. The numbers haven't been loaded in for 2022 yet, but once they do, then obviously then we will see where we are with those emissions. But now we've got those emissions, now we understand it. Okay, how are we going to reduce it? How are we going to tackle it? We're going to do that through scorecards. Again, the demo gods are not very kind to me, so I'm going to take you through another scorecard. So effectively what we would see here is a scorecard very similar to this scorecard, but it would be inside the application. Now, with scorecards, what you would be able to do is have goals around the percentage of maybe percentage completion of something, or the volume of something compared to your targets. So obviously for us, in the Crimson housing, although we know we've got until 2030, we've made a corporate decision to actually get EPC ratings to 100% by 2025. And therefore, we've actually had a look at that. And what you can see is that you can have sub goals that relate to this. So the way that we're going to get to those EPC ratings are by a number of factors in terms of retrofitting. So at the moment, we've got 20,000 retrofits of an estimated 45,000 that we need to do by December. And again, those heat pump installations, we've already done 201, but we need to get to 800 by 2025. So we're quite behind on our fabrics retrofits for our houses, but these two scores combined will hopefully get us up to the right EPC rating and to get us from 55% up to 100% of our stock. So what you can see here is a way in which we can use the reporting and analysis to drive the initiative, and then still track those initiatives by the raw numbers that are coming out the system. So we know from the fact that we've loaded those EPC rating within the sustainability app, well, that's brilliant. We can now report on that and work out how many of those are actually in the right rating, and what we need to do to capture that. So I've talked on quite a lot about the application. There's loads there, but it is really, really powerful application. But again, it takes a while to get your head around exactly all of the different types of models and calculations. But I thought I'd just give you a brief overview of what we've got there.